Dr. Leonard Briggs was the dentist everyone trusted, polished, respected, and admired by an entire town. But behind his perfect smile, he was hiding secrets so dark they would shock the nation. This is the story of how a beloved doctor turned into a cold-blooded predator. Watch until the end, because what investigators uncovered beneath his clinic will leave you speechless. And don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories just like this one. In Fairview, a quiet suburban town where most people knew each other by name, Dr. Leonard Briggs was seen as a pillar of the community. His dental clinic sat right in the heart of Main Street, a spotless white building with polished glass windows and a glowing sign that read, Briggs Dental Care. To the townspeople, it symbolized reliability and safety. Parents brought their children there for their first checkups, and older residents trusted Leonard to handle their most delicate procedures. He had a calm, reassuring manner that made even the most nervous patients feel at ease in the chair. His smile was always practiced but never appeared forced, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to being admired. Leonard's reputation extended far beyond his clinic. He donated generously to local schools, sponsored youth sports teams, and was often the first to volunteer at charity events. If a family couldn't afford treatment, he quietly waived the bill, a gesture that only strengthened the belief that he was a man of extraordinary kindness. At town gatherings, people would speak of him with respect, and even those who hardly knew him considered him a role model. On paper, he was perfect, successful, philanthropic, and utterly trustworthy. But there were things about Leonard Briggs that no one in Fairview ever questioned closely enough. He lived in an expansive home on the edge of town, far larger than one person needed. The house, set back behind tall hedges and a wrought iron gate, was as immaculate as his clinic, but visitors were rare. He rarely entertained friends or neighbors, preferring instead to keep to himself after work. When asked about his personal life, he would offer vague explanations, saying that his profession demanded long hours and little time for leisure. It was an answer that satisfied most people, since his dedication to his patients was already well known. Leonard also maintained an unusual level of control over his clinic. He employed only a handful of staff members, and turnover was frequent. Assistants often left within a year or two, always citing vague reasons about wanting to move on. Still, the community never saw this as strange. Many assumed that working under a perfectionist like Leonard might simply be demanding. Patients, after all, never saw anything out of place. The equipment gleamed, the floors shone, and the atmosphere was calm and professional. Yet there was something in the way Leonard lived that suggested he was always careful, always calculated. He avoided long conversations about his past and never shared much about his family. To most, it didn't matter. His present-day image was enough to inspire trust. But hidden beneath that spotless exterior was a man with secrets too dark for anyone to imagine. Behind the polite greetings, the steady hands, and the warm persona was a side of Leonard Briggs that no patient or neighbor had ever glimpsed. It was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when the perfect mask of the town's beloved dentist would finally crack. The first disappearance hardly stirred panic in Fairview. A young woman in her early 20s named Alyssa Bennett was reported missing by her roommate after she failed to return home one evening. Police suspected she had left voluntarily. She was independent, restless, and known for dreaming about leaving the small town behind. Friends recalled her talking about opportunities in the city, so her absence was treated as little more than a personal choice. Flyers were posted, a few questions were asked, and life in Fairview carried on. When the second woman vanished 6 months later, the situation was harder to dismiss. Her name was Claire Dawson, a recent graduate who had just started working at a nearby law office. She was responsible, close with her family, and known for her punctuality. One morning, she failed to show up at work. Days turned into weeks, and no sign of her surfaced. This time, police launched a larger search effort, combing through her digital footprint and interviewing her friends. They found no evidence of travel, no financial activity, and no goodbye messages left behind. To many in the community, the thought of a predator in their midst began to take root, though no one wanted to say it out loud. By the time a third young woman went missing, fear began to spread. Her name was Naomi Ellis, a waitress at a local diner who had been saving money for college. She disappeared on a rainy evening after finishing her shift, her car still parked outside the diner as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Unlike the previous cases, Naomi's disappearance ignited public alarm. Vigils were held, search parties organized, and whispers of something sinister circulated through the town. Investigators began piecing together timelines, desperate to find a connection that could explain the vanishings. What emerged was a troubling detail. Each of the missing women had scheduled an appointment at Briggs Dental shortly before disappearing. Alyssa had gone for a routine cleaning. Claire had booked a late-night appointment for a cracked tooth. Naomi had visited just 2 days before she vanished. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Still, suspicion toward Leonard Briggs was difficult to accept. He was the town's most trusted professional, someone whose name had never been associated with wrongdoing. Police hesitated, reluctant to act against a man so highly regarded. Rumors swirled, but many residents defended him, insisting there had to be some other explanation. For a while, this hesitation allowed Leonard to continue as if nothing had changed. He kept his clinic open, welcomed patients with the same practice charm, and carried on his work without a hint of concern. But underneath the calm surface of the town, unease was growing. Parents began warning their daughters not to walk alone at night. Businesses started closing earlier. Every missing poster taped to the lampposts was a silent reminder that someone in Fairview was responsible for unthinkable acts. And though nobody dared to say his name too loudly, the quiet threads of suspicion were all pointing in the same direction: the polished dentist who had always seemed too perfect. The investigation took a sharp turn the day a utility worker was dispatched to fix a downed power line behind Leonard Briggs' sprawling property. While walking along the wooded edge near the back fence, the worker noticed patches of soil that appeared freshly disturbed. The sight was odd enough to raise questions, especially since the rest of the ground was hard and covered in fallen leaves. He reported it to his supervisor, who in turn notified authorities. At first, police assumed it might have been simple yard work or landscaping. But when they dug a little deeper, the reality was far more unsettling. Buried beneath the earth were several bags, each carefully sealed in plastic. Inside, investigators found women's clothing, pieces of jewelry, and personal identification cards belonging to the 3 missing women. The discovery stunned even seasoned officers. These weren't random items. They were trophies, mementos of lives that had suddenly gone dark. And yet, as disturbing as the find was, one crucial element was missing: there were no bodies. The absence of human remains made the case more complicated. Without clear evidence of murder, authorities couldn't formally accuse Leonard of the worst. But suspicion was now impossible to dismiss. They placed him under discreet surveillance, monitoring his every move. It didn't take long for them to notice behaviors that raised even more red flags. Leonard was often awake deep into the night, making unexplained trips back to his clinic. The lights would burn until the early hours, long after patients and staff had gone home. On several occasions, large deliveries of medical supplies were brought to the clinic, quantities far greater than what a small-town dentist should reasonably need. One of the most striking details came from an interview with a former dental assistant. She recalled how Leonard was obsessive about handling biohazard containers himself. Unlike other practices, where assistants and staff routinely disposed of medical waste, Leonard never allowed anyone else to touch it. He would take the sealed containers away personally, always brushing off questions with vague explanations about safety protocols. At the time, staff thought he was simply strict about cleanliness. But now, those habits seemed to fit a much darker purpose. The mounting evidence left investigators uneasy. They couldn't confront Leonard directly without risking the loss of crucial proof. Instead, they dug deeper into his life. They traced his purchases, noting large orders of sedatives and anesthetics, drugs typically used in dentistry but in quantities that raised serious concerns. They checked his financial records, uncovering odd expenses tied to specialized equipment rarely found outside surgical environments. Piece by piece, a chilling picture began to emerge, one that suggested Leonard's clinic was more than just a place for dental care. As the town of Fairview carried on in blissful ignorance, law enforcement worked quietly in the shadows, building their case. The question was no longer whether Leonard Briggs had secrets. It was how many, and how long he had been keeping them hidden. The disturbed soil had opened the door, and what lay beyond promised to be far darker than anyone had imagined. When police finally secured the warrant to search Leonard Briggs' clinic, they entered with a mix of anticipation and dread. From the outside, the building looked exactly as the community had always known it: clean white walls, perfectly trimmed hedges, and the familiar glow of the sign promising smiles and care. Inside, the The waiting room was just as expected. Magazines were neatly stacked, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the dental chairs gleamed under bright overhead lights. For a few moments, investigators wondered if they had been wrong, if their suspicions had been the product of coincidence and paranoia. But then they moved deeper. In the basement, they noticed something unusual. One wall did not align with the blueprints they had studied. Behind a set of shelves stacked with supplies, there was a faint seam, almost imperceptible. When officers pushed against it, the wall gave way to a hidden door. What they stepped into was nothing like the sterile, professional clinic upstairs. The room beyond was a secret chamber designed with chilling precision. The walls were soundproofed with heavy padding, ensuring no screams could escape. Bolted to the concrete floor were chains and restraints, positioned in front of a reclining dental chair. Stainless steel trays held surgical tools lined up with disturbing neatness: forceps, scalpels, syringes, and drills, all spotless but clearly well used. The air was thick with a sharp odor of chemicals, enough to sting the eyes and burn the nose. A locked cabinet was pried open, and its contents froze even the most experienced officers. Inside were jars, each labeled with a date, each containing human teeth. Some jars held only a few, while others were filled nearly to the top. It was clear Leonard had been keeping trophies, cataloging his victims with a level of organization that spoke to both obsession and pride. Forensic teams moved through the room, collecting fibers, fluids, and fingerprints. Hidden in a corner, they discovered a small refrigerator stocked not with dental materials but with vials of sedatives and anesthetics. The quantities were staggering, far beyond what a dentist would ever need for legitimate practice. Alongside them sat several empty containers, suggesting frequent use. The evidence pointed to a grim reality. Leonard hadn't just harmed his victims. He had created a controlled environment where he could take as much time as he wished. His skills as a dentist had given him both the tools and the knowledge to manipulate, sedate, and ultimately destroy without immediate detection. The secrecy of his setup showed years of preparation and a chilling confidence that he would never be caught. Word of the search spread quickly through Fairview, but the public was shielded from the details. Only those inside the basement knew the full horror that had been hidden beneath the respectable clinic. The discovery shattered the illusion of safety that had surrounded Leonard Briggs for so long. The man who promised healthy smiles had been running a chamber of suffering in plain sight, right where the town felt most secure. When Leonard Briggs was finally arrested, the town of Fairview erupted in disbelief. Residents who had once spoken his name with admiration now whispered it with fear. News cameras swarmed the courthouse as the smiling dentist, still in his crisp white coat, was led away in handcuffs. His arrest shook the foundations of a community that had trusted him for years. Parents who had once thanked him for calming their children in the dentist's chair now stared in horror at the man accused of unimaginable crimes. During the trial, the prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece, and each detail painted a picture more disturbing than the last. Jurors saw photographs of the hidden chamber beneath the clinic, the soundproof walls, and the restraints bolted to the floor. They were shown the jars filled with human teeth, each marked with dates that stretched back further than anyone had expected. Forensic teams testified about traces of blood and DNA matching the missing women. Even the jewelry and identification cards unearthed in Leonard's yard were presented, tying him directly to the victims who had vanished. The most unsettling moments came when medical experts explained how Leonard had abused his professional skills. He had easy access to sedatives, anesthetics, and surgical tools. He knew how to administer just enough drugs to incapacitate someone without immediately killing them. This knowledge, which should have been used to ease pain and heal, had been twisted into a method of control and cruelty. It was not a crime of impulse but of careful planning, repeated over years while the town unknowingly praised him for his dedication. Leonard himself showed little emotion throughout the proceedings. He sat calmly, his expression unreadable, as though the accusations barely touched him. To many in the courtroom, it seemed as if he still believed he could outwit the system, that his spotless reputation might somehow shield him from justice. But the evidence was overwhelming, and no amount of charm could erase the horrors uncovered in his clinic. The jury took less than 2 days to return a verdict: guilty on multiple counts of murder, unlawful confinement, and tampering with evidence. When the judge sentenced Leonard Briggs to life without the possibility of parole, a hush fell over the room. For some families, the verdict brought relief, but for others, it deepened the pain. The bodies of their loved ones had never been recovered, and the unanswered questions lingered like a shadow. Fairview was never the same again. The pristine white clinic that once stood as a symbol of trust was shuttered and left to decay. Parents grew cautious, locking doors and warning their children never to place blind faith in anyone, no matter how respectable they seemed. The smiling image of Dr. Leonard Briggs, once printed in community newsletters and charity programs, was now synonymous with betrayal and terror. His case became a cautionary tale, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the most trusted masks.